Welcome to another edition of our series of talking with local veterans and their service to our nation. And I'm honored today to be interviewing Joe Anderson. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Jerry.
Everybody knows Joe, who has done monument work for years locally. And he's been a friend and city councilman, and he came here, or we could say migrated here, in 1960 from Charleston, West Virginia. And he joins us today to talk about his experience in the service. Joe, you're from Charleston, West Virginia. How did you come to find your way to Clifton Forge?
Well, it was a little long history, I guess. When I graduated from high school, I went to work for DuPont. And eventually I was in their, what they called their works laboratory. And they told me, pardon me, that they could get me a deferment if I wanted to work there. And I didn't want that. I volunteered for the Coast Guard, and I rode the train through Clifton Forge. That's how I got to New York.
But Charleston was, of course, when you volunteered for the Coast Guard, this was 1944, wasn't it?
Right.
And, Charleston's a long way from the sea.
Right.
Getting into the Coast Guard, did you experience the same experience I have on a ship initially, the up and down? How did a guy from West Virginia learn to deal with that?
Oh, it wasn't hard. There was a group of us that went together, which I wasn't acquainted with any of them really, but it made up our group of fellows that were volunteering, and they shipped us out and put us on a train that come through Clifton Forge to Manhattan Beach, New York for our boot camp. And after we finished that, I went down to what they call Sheepshead Bay in Baltimore to fireman's school. And when we finished that course, a bunch of us were put on a troop train going from Baltimore to Alameda, California, to a Coast Guard station. Somewhere in that stretch of time, my health records got lost, and they wouldn't ship me out. They shipped everybody else out that went to the West Coast. But after a few weeks, they sent me down to Long Beach Harbor on a ship that they were commissioning a new Coast Guard cutter called the Iroquois. And that's where I was when they ended the war.
Well, I would imagine when you first joined the Coast Guard, wasn't there at that time a big fear that the Japanese would attack the west coast of the United States?
Yeah, I guess there was, probably was.
And I don't know much about the Coast Guard, but did the ships that you served on, did you have to learn how to fire various types of weapons?
Not really. No.
Not really?
No, I was down in the engine room.
Oh my goodness. Where it got 120 degrees, huh?
Right, yeah. You had a blower blowing in on you all the time.
How long did you stay in the Coast Guard?
I was in there, first time I was in there for a year, 2 months and 20 days when the war was over.
Well, and did the military attempt to ask you to come back during the Korean conflict?
No, I've never been bothered on any of the other wars, fortunately. I've really led a nice life.
Well, the Coast Guard, was basic training in the Coast Guard a really demanding thing for you?
Well, I don't remember much about it, to tell you the truth, Jerry. And I enjoyed it. It was a good experience. And after I got discharged, a couple of months after I got discharged, I re-enlisted for 2 years. So I enjoyed my time in service.
Well, not probably that many guys re-enlisted. What was so attractive to you that you decided to serve another 2 years?
Well, at that time, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I got out. And I figured in another 2 years I would know. And it's worked out good for me.
During your experience with the Coast Guard, can you recall anything that you thought was just really surprising or amazing during your service? I mean, Charleston, West Virginia was a fairly big town, but
yeah.
going to California, that's an entirely different world.
Yeah, well, I guess the best experiences I had was when we had Liberty up in New York City. That was quite an experience.
I can imagine.
And from boot camp up there. But I'm very fortunate in my time that I wasn't involved in any conflicts, actually.
Yeah, I see. After you finished your Coast Guard service, there's a long time between that and coming to Clifton Forge in 1960. What were you up to during that period?
Well, while I was in the Coast Guard, I married my wife, Louise, and I decided that I wanted to be an embalmer and funeral director. And my family, I had family that was located in Webster Springs, West Virginia. And they were good friends of a funeral director up there. And when I got out of service, I went to work for him right away. And he had a program for us GIs that were on the GI Bill. And there was about 4 or 5 of us at different times that worked for him. And we had a 2-year apprenticeship we had to serve with him. And at the end of that, I went to mortuary science school in Chicago for a year. And I come back to Webster Springs when I finished that. And lived there for quite a few years. Small town.
But somehow you found your way to Clifton Forge.
Right,
And by the way, we're delighted you did.
right.